The dust in Cedar Hollow had a taste. It was red and fine, a mixture of Montana soil and forgotten dreams. It settled on everything: the raw lumber of the general store, the canvas tops of freight wagons, and the hopeful glass of the new church windows. The town was wedged in a crease of the mountains, a place of sharp edges and long shadows. Above, the peaks held their snow well into the spring. Below, the dry creek bed was a pale skeleton waiting for thaw. Eliza Hart felt the dust in her throat as she walked from the small room she rented to the old barn that now served as both school and library. At 24, she carried herself with a stillness that belonged to someone much older. Her father had loved books more than business, and when he died, he left her a shelf of poetry and a mountain of debt to the Cedar Hollow Bank. Mercer Hale, the banker, had placed the papers before her sick father's hand. He'd called it a simple favor to see them through the winter, but the ink had been poison. It bound their land, their future, and their lives to the railroad's hunger. Now her father lay in the frozen ground, and the debt remained, a cold stone pressing against her chest. She taught the children their letters by day and mended shirts by night. Every dollar she earned was a drop of water against wildfire, but Mercer Hale made sure she knew her efforts were hopeless. He was the kind of man whose smile never reached his eyes, all smooth words and cold intentions. When he announced his latest, quote, charitable endeavor, the whole town understood what it truly meant. A matchmaking social, he called it, for the lonely bachelors and hard-working men of the territory to find wives. But everyone knew it was an auction block for the indebted, a way for Hale to dress chains in lace and call them vows. Eliza was informed, not asked, that her presence was required. Her father's debt, Hale explained, made her a prime candidate for a beneficial union. That same afternoon, a stranger rode down from the mountains, Jonah Creed. He was a man carved from the wilderness itself, tall, broad-shouldered, his face weathered by wind and years. 35, maybe older. His dark hair was streaked with silver, his eyes sharp and distant. He led a pack horse heavy with bundled beaver and fox pelts, and he moved with the quiet assurance of a man who had long ago learned to live without company. For 10 years, Jonah had lived alone on Elk Trace Pass, coming to town only when necessity demanded it. A ghost from the high country. The stories about him were legend, that he'd killed 3 men in a feud with the Kellermans, that he'd burned their ranch to ash and vanished into the wild. Folks whispered the tales in low voices, never sure how much was true. Jonah never bothered to deny any of it. He sold his furs to the trader, bought flour, salt, and a box of cartridges, then turned to leave. But a sound stopped him. Laughter, forced and hollow, spilling from the open doors of the church. He saw the crowd gathering, the nervous women being herded inside, and the smug gleam of Mercer Hale, standing at the pulpit like a spider in his web. Jonah's jaw tightened. He had seen that kind of man before, men who smiled while they bled others dry. He turned to go, but then he saw her, Eliza Hart. She stood near the church steps, her hands clenched at her sides, her face pale but calm. There was no hope in her eyes, only quiet dread. Jonah remembered her, the schoolteacher who read to the children in the shade of the livery stable. A woman who didn't belong in a place as cruel as Cedar Hollow. He watched Hale approach her, his hand touching her elbow like he already owned her. She flinched, a small, involuntary movement that struck Jonah deeper than he expected. In that instant, his plans changed. Inside the church, the air was thick with perfume, sweat, and fear. Mercer Hale's voice rolled through the room like oil over water, preaching of community, family, and divine providence. Eliza stood on the dais with 3 other women, all of them bound by invisible chains of debt. When Hale called her name, she walked forward like someone in a dream. He spoke of her virtues, a fine teacher, he said, of good breeding despite her unfortunate circumstances. He mentioned the debt, wrapping it in honeyed words, inviting men to redeem her with land, cattle, or coin. It was not a proposal. It was foreclosure. Then the church door swung open, flooding the hall with afternoon light. Jonah Creed stood there. He stepped inside, slow and steady, his boots echoing against the wooden floor. The room fell silent. Even Hale's smile faltered. Jonah's gaze swept the pews, then fixed on Eliza. He reached into his coat, pulled out a deerskin pouch and dropped it onto the preacher's table. Gold dust spilled out, coarse, heavy, and real. "I'll cover the debt," Jonah said. His voice was quiet but carried like thunder. "We'll be married." A gasp rippled through the church. Hale's face hardened. "This is a social, not a brawl, Mr. Creed," he hissed. Jonah looked at him, eyes cold and steady. "The debt's paid. The woman's free. She'll marry me." The preacher hesitated, glancing at Hale, but the gold on the table gleamed like judgment. To refuse it would expose the entire event as the sham it was, and the law, even twisted as Hale bent it, couldn't deny a debt once paid. The choice, suddenly, belonged to Eliza. She looked at Hale's fury, then at Jonah's unreadable face. In his eyes she saw no hunger, no claim, only quiet strength. He wasn't offering love, he was offering escape. "I accept," she whispered, and so, before the stunned eyes of Cedar Hollow, Eliza Hart became Mrs. Jonah Creed. The wedding was a blur. The preacher's words were rushed, his hands trembling as he read from the book. The town whispered behind their hands. Jonah Creed, the mountain ghost, had bought himself a wife. Mercer Hale sat in the front pew, his face pale with fury, already plotting his next move. Jonah stood beside Eliza like a stone statue. When the ceremony ended, he took her hand, rough, calloused, and warm, and led her out into the fading light. He helped her mount his horse, swung into the saddle behind her, and without another word, they rode away from Cedar Hollow. The trail wound higher into the mountains, the air growing colder, cleaner. The silence between them was thick, but not cruel. She didn't know this man, yet something about his presence, his steady breathing, his sure hands on the reins, felt safe. Below them, the town shrank into a toy village, its gossip carried away by the wind. By dusk, they reached the cabin. It was small but solid, built from thick logs fitted tight, the roof neatly pitched, the chimney trailing a faint ribbon of smoke. Inside, it smelled of pine, leather, and wood smoke. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, a sturdy table, shelves of tins and jars, and a bed built into the corner made up the rest. Jonah dropped his pack, took a blanket from the bed, and laid it on a long bench beneath the window. He gave her the bed without a word. It wasn't gallantry, it was respect. He didn't touch her, didn't even look too long, just nodded toward the fire. "There's stew in the pot. Eat if you're hungry." That first night, neither slept well. She lay listening to the wind rattle the shutters, to the soft creak of the bench where he turned once, then went still. For the first time in months, she wasn't afraid of waking to a knock on the door or the cold voice of Mercer Hale demanding payment. But she wasn't free either. Not yet. Days fell into rhythm. Jonah rose before dawn, splitting wood or checking his traps while Eliza cooked or tidied. He showed her how to bank the fire so it lived through the night, how to fetch clean water from the spring, how to read the tracks in the snow. His words were few, but when he spoke they carried weight. He lived by the land with a quiet grace that fascinated her. Every motion had purpose, every silence meaning. He was a man shaped by solitude, by storms and scars. At first, she feared him, the power in his hands, the coldness in his eyes, but fear slowly turned into understanding. He wasn't cruel. He was guarded. She found a small, leather-bound journal among his few possessions. Inside were careful sketches of herbs and recipes for salves, written in a woman's hand, his mother's. It told her more about Jonah Creed than he ever would himself. Winter was breaking its hold when the first visitor came. Nate Walker, tall and lean, with the calm manner of a man who'd seen too much and judged none of it. He greeted Jonah with an easy smile and Eliza with a respectful nod. "Brought some salt pork and news," he said. "Town's in a stir." Hale's telling folks Jonah Creed kidnapped a schoolteacher." Eliza felt her stomach turn. "That's a lie," she said sharply. "Jonah saved me." Nate nodded. "I believe you, ma'am, but Hale's got money, and money gets ears." When he left, the air in the cabin changed. Jonah grew quieter, watchful. His rifle was never far from reach. The peace of the mountain became fragile. Then one morning, while putting away supplies, Eliza discovered a loose board in the cupboard wall. Behind it, wrapped in oilcloth, she found a small ledger and a folded letter stained dark red, blood. The letter was written by Abel Morris, the bank's accountant. He confessed everything: Hale's embezzlement, the fake loans, the poisoning of her father's medicine with wolfsbane to cloud his mind. Abel wrote that he'd hidden the truth and now feared for his life. Eliza read it twice, trembling. Her father hadn't died of sickness. He'd been murdered. When Jonah came in, she showed him the letter and the ledger. He read them without a word. His jaw tightened, his hand clenched into a fist. "Hale did this?" he asked quietly. "Yes," she whispered. "And this ledger proves it." Jonah's eyes darkened. "Then it's time someone brought him to account." They couldn't do it alone. That night, they rode down to Nate Walker's ranch. He studied the ledger by lantern light, shaking his head. "These marks here, railroad payments, bribes, this symbol, that's poison. Mrs. Lynn uses it in her apothecary books." They rode to Mrs. Lynn next. In the scented back room of her laundry, the old woman read the pages with sharp eyes. "Black Snake Hills," she said, tracing one symbol. "That's where they mine silver and steal from the government. This mark, it means money to a marshal. Dangerous men." With her help, they pieced together Hale's corruption. They would take it to Judge Harrison, who was due in Cedar Hollow in 2 weeks. But before justice, the mountain tested them. A sudden blizzard swept down from the peaks, a white wall of fury. Snow howled against the windows, rattling the cabin like a living beast. Jonah and Eliza fought side by side to save the horses, forcing them to move in circles so they wouldn't freeze. Their fingers bled, their faces numb, but they endured. When at last they stumbled inside, soaked and trembling, Jonah threw another log on the fire. They collapsed together on the floor, too exhausted to speak. For a long time, the only sound was their ragged breathing and the steady crackle of the flames. Something changed in that silence. They were no longer strangers bound by a debt. They were partners in survival. Later, when the storm eased, Eliza sat by the fire, her shawl around her shoulders. Jonah was across from her, sharpening his knife. She looked at his scars, at the deep weariness in his eyes. "Tell me what happened," she said softly. "With the Kellermans." Jonah's hand stilled. For a long time he said nothing. Then, without looking up, he spoke in a low voice that sounded more like confession than story. "They came with torches," he said. "Drunk, wanted my land, tried to burn me out. I told them to leave. One drew his pistol. I fired first. It was them or me." His words hung in the air like smoke. "I didn't want blood," he said quietly, "but they left me no choice." Eliza watched him, tears stinging her eyes. "You did what you had to do." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and in that moment, she saw not a killer, but a man who had lived too long in the shadow of one night. Outside, the storm began to break. The snow stopped falling. The silence that followed felt clean, like forgiveness, but the mountain wasn't the only thing stirring that night. In Cedar Hollow, Mercer Hale was already planning how to destroy them both. The next dawn broke in silence, soft lights spilling over the snow-covered peaks. For a few precious hours, the world felt still, almost kind. But when Jonah went to check the snares, he found tracks, boot prints, too many to belong to hunters. His instincts sharpened at once. By mid-morning, he saw smoke drifting up from the trees below the ridge. Not a campfire. A signal. The bounty hunters had found them. Mercer Hale's wanted posters had turned the law into a weapon. Jonah came back to the cabin fast, his face set. "Pack what you need," he told Eliza. "They're coming." Before they could move, the first shot cracked through the cold air. The bullet splintered the window frame, scattering glass across the floor. Eliza ducked behind the hearth. Jonah grabbed his rifle, already bleeding from a nick on his arm. 3 men, maybe 4, moving through the pines like wolves. He fired once, twice, driving them back, but another round tore through the door, grazing his shoulder. He staggered, blood soaking through his shirt. Eliza crawled to him, her heart hammering, her hands slick with fear and smoke. The wound was deep, pulsing bright red. She needed to stop the bleeding. Frantic, she looked around for cloth, but the linens were across the room, within the line of fire. Without hesitation, she tore open the front of her blouse, ripping a strip from the cotton to press against his wound. Jonah caught his breath, eyes glazed with pain and something more, an ache deeper than the bullet. "God help me," he whispered, pressing his body against her hands to hold the bandage firm. Their breath mingled in the cold air. His blood soaked the fabric between them. For a heartbeat, the danger outside vanished, and all that existed was the desperate will to keep him alive. When the bleeding slowed, Eliza guided him to the chair by the fire. She boiled water, cleaned the wound, and stitched it shut with a trembling hand, following the old journal's instructions. Jonah never cried out, just watched her face with quiet awe. By the time she tied the final knot, dawn light was spilling across the cabin floor. They were alive, but it wasn't over. That night, as Jonah slept, she couldn't rest. The wanted posters, the poison in her father's medicine, the ledger, they all pointed to one truth. Mercer Hale's lies would keep chasing them until someone dragged them into the light. "We have to go down the mountain," she said when he woke. "We have to tell the judge." Jonah's jaw clenched. The trails watched. "Then, we'll take another way." He hesitated, then nodded. "There's an old mine shaft. Runs straight into town." At dusk, 2 days later, under the fog, they set out. Jonah, pale but steady, carried a pistol at his side. He stopped at the ridge and pointed to a dark hole beneath the rocks. "The ladder's old. Go first. Follow the left tunnel till you see light." He pressed a lantern into her hands. His touch lingered for a second. Rough, protective. "Be careful, Eliza." She wanted to tell him not to risk himself, but his eyes told her he'd already decided. He would draw them away. She would carry the proof. The shaft smelled of damp earth and silence. The descent seemed endless. At last, faint light glowed ahead. When she stepped out behind the livery stable in Cedar Hollow, the town was chaos. Fire at the rail yard, men shouting. Jonah's diversion was working. She ran through back alleys to the hotel where Judge Harrison was staying. The old man listened as she told everything, her voice trembling but fierce. When she showed him the letter and ledger, he grew pale. "This will hang Mercer Hale," he said quietly. Outside, angry voices gathered. Hale had realized the truth. He roused a mob, shouting that Jonah Creed had bewitched and kidnapped her. The crowd, drunk on fear, stormed toward the hotel. Nate Walker rode in through the noise, blocking the steps with his horse. "Leave the lady be," he commanded. The mob hesitated, but not for long. Gunshots cracked in the distance. Up in the belfry of the church, Jonah was cornered. He'd led the bounty men away from town, but now he was trapped. Bullets smashed into the bell, each clang ringing like thunder. One tore across his cheek. At sunrise, Judge Harrison strode into the bank with 2 deputies. He laid the ledger and the blood-stained letter on the counter. "Mercer Hale," he said, "you're under arrest for murder and fraud." The banker's smug mask shattered. He spat in fury, but the cuffs clicked shut. The next days blurred into whispers and newspaper ink. Hale's empire fell apart. The stolen land returned, the poison uncovered. The truth of Eliza's father's death revealed. Cedar Hollow began to breathe again, but Jonah still carried the wound of the old feud. He and Eliza set out to return home, choosing a narrow pass through Black Snake Canyon. The air there was thin and cold, the trail hemmed in by stone walls. Halfway through, 5 men stepped from the rocks, rifles aimed. At their front stood Vincent Kellerman, the last of the family Jonah was said to have murdered. "I've waited 10 years for this," Vincent said. Jonah sat straight in the saddle. Then end it. Eliza's heart pounded. She slid from her horse, placing herself between the guns and Jonah. If you shoot him, you'll become the thing you hate, she said. This vengeance, will it bring your brothers back? Her words cut through the canyon like wind. For a moment, Vincent's hand trembled. Then the mountain itself spoke, a low rumble deep in the stone. Rocks shifted, sliding down in a sudden roar. When the dust cleared, the trail was blocked. Vincent lowered his pistol. She's right, he said, voice hollow. I'm done carrying ghosts. He turned away, his men following. Jonah and Eliza watched them go as sunlight broke through the clouds, spilling gold over the canyon. He turned to her, his eyes softer than she'd ever seen. You saved my life, he said quietly, again. They rode home in silence. Weeks passed. The snow melted. Spring crept over the mountain. Nate brought word that Mercer Hale had been convicted, his wealth used to repay the town. Judge Harrison had cleared Jonah's name at last. The killings ruled self-defense. When they finally rode back into Cedar Hollow, people didn't whisper, they nodded. Some even smiled. Back on Elk Trace Pass, peace returned. Jonah added a porch to the cabin. Eliza planted beans by the steps. They shared coffee at dawn, laughter at dusk, and silence that no longer felt heavy. One evening, Jonah handed her a small, uneven silver ring he'd hammered himself. That first wedding, he said, was a bargain. This one's for love. Will you have me again? She smiled through tears. Yes, Jonah, I will. Months later, the church bell tolled softly across the valley. In their cabin, the fire burned low. A pine cradle sat beside it, rocking gently in the mountain breeze. Eliza rested her hand on her belly, where new life stirred beneath her shawl. Jonah stood beside her, his scar pale in the firelight. The past was buried, the debt repaid. The mountains, once a prison, were now their home. And for the first time, both of them were truly free.